The photograph was faded, nearly brown with age, but the faces staring back were unmistakable. 18 children, their skin pale as porcelain, their eyes ranging from blue to hazel to green. They stood in descending height order, the oldest barely reaching adulthood, the youngest still clutching a rag doll. Behind them, barely visible in the corner of the frame, stood a black woman whose eyes held both defiance and devastating sorrow. For 140 years, her name was whispered in shame throughout Charleston County. They called her a Jezebel, a temptress, a woman of loose morals. But when historian Dr. Amelia Cross discovered a leather-bound ledger in the abandoned Whitmore Plantation archives in 2024, everything changed. The meticulous handwriting revealed a truth so horrifying, so systematic, that it would finally vindicate a woman's silence by history and expose the monster who hid behind respectability for his entire life. This is the story of Rose, a woman whose body was used as a weapon against her own freedom, and the 18 children who carried the evidence of her suffering in their very skin. Rose was 14 years old when she first caught the attention of Edmund Whitmore III, the heir to one of South Carolina's most prosperous cotton plantations. It was 1847, and she had just been brought in from the fields to work in the main house, her mother having convinced the plantation mistress that Rose had gentle hands perfect for delicate lacework and fine china. Rose's mother, Celia, thought she was saving her daughter from the backbreaking labor that had bent her own spine into a permanent curve. She had no way of knowing she was delivering her child into a different kind of hell. Edmund was 23, recently returned from Harvard, and engaged to Mary Catherine Montgomery, the daughter of a neighboring plantation owner. He was tall, fair-haired, and considered quite handsome by the standards of Charleston society. He was also a predator who had learned at his father's knee that enslaved women were property to be used in any way their masters saw fit. The first time Edmund cornered Rose in the silver pantry, she was polishing a serving tray. She remembered the smell of his cologne, something expensive and floral that would make her nauseous for the rest of her life. She remembered his hand covering her mouth, his other hand gathering up her plain cotton dress. She remembered thinking of her mother's face, her hope that housework would be easier, safer. She remembered understanding in that moment that there was no safety for girls who looked like her in places owned by men who looked like him. Rose never told her mother what happened that day, or any of the days that followed. What would be the point? Her mother had no power to stop it. The law didn't recognize what was happening to Rose as a crime. In the eyes of South Carolina in 1847, Rose wasn't a person capable of being violated. She was property, and Edmund Whitmore III could do with his property as he pleased. 9 months after that first assault in the silver pantry, Rose gave birth to a daughter. The midwife who attended her, an elderly enslaved woman named Aunt Judith, wept when she placed the infant in Rose's arms. The baby's skin was pale, her hair soft and brown with a gentle wave rather than Rose's tight coils. Her eyes, when they finally opened, were the same steel blue as Edmund Whitmore's. They named her Grace, though there was no grace in how she came into the world. Edmund's wife, Catherine, had given birth to their first legitimate child just 3 months earlier, a son named Edmund IV, heir to the Whitmore fortune. Catherine never set foot in the slave quarters, never laid eyes on little Grace, and if she suspected her husband of fathering children with the women he owned, she followed the unspoken rule of plantation mistresses everywhere. She looked the other way, but looking away didn't mean the other enslaved people didn't notice, didn't whisper, didn't watch as Rose's belly swelled again and again, as child after child was born with features that mapped directly onto Edmund Whitmore's face. The other enslaved women tried to protect Rose when they could, creating reasons for her to be elsewhere when Edmund came looking, but they couldn't be everywhere. And Edmund was patient. He would wait. By the time Rose was 20, she had 4 children. By 25, she had 9. The pattern was relentless, mechanical, horrifying in its regularity. Edmund would visit the quarters, would find Rose, and 9 months later another pale-skinned baby would arrive. The children grew up knowing who their father was. Everyone on the plantation knew, but they were forbidden from acknowledging it. Edmund's legitimate white children played in the gardens, while their half-siblings worked in those same gardens, pulling weeds and carrying water. The cruelty of it wasn't lost on Rose. Her children carried their father's features like a brand, their light skin and European features marking them as different from the other enslaved children, but not different enough to claim any protection or privilege. In fact, their appearance often made things worse. The other enslaved children sometimes ostracized them, seeing them as reminders of the master's power and violence. The white overseers treated them with particular suspicion, as if their very existence was an accusation that needed to be answered with extra brutality. Rose tried to love them. These children born from violence. Some days it was easier than others. Grace, her eldest, had her mother's gentle spirit despite everything. She would sing to her younger siblings, creating melodies that spoke of rivers and freedom, and a home none of them had ever known. Thomas, the second child, was quiet and watchful, his blue eyes always scanning for danger. Mary, the third, had inherited Rose's stubborn will, and would stand between her mother and Edmund when he came calling, even though she was barely tall enough to reach his waist, even though he would simply move her aside like a piece of furniture. By the time the Civil War began in 1861, Rose had 13 children. She was 33 years old and looked 50. Her body was worn from continuous pregnancies, her spirit battered by years of systematic rape, her heart broken by watching her children grow up enslaved by their own father. Edmund was 42, a respected member of Charleston society, a Confederate colonel who gave passionate speeches about states' rights and the natural order of things. He had 9 legitimate children with Catherine, and he acknowledged none of the 13 he had fathered with Rose. The war years were strange for the Whitmore plantation. Edmund was often away with his regiment, and during those blessed absences Rose could almost breathe. But he always came back, and when he did, he reasserted his claim over her with a possessiveness that seemed to intensify with each return. It was as if the chaos of war made him cling more tightly to the power he had at home, the power to take what he wanted from a woman who had no ability to refuse him. In 1863, Rose gave birth to twin boys, Nathan and Isaac, both with Edmund's distinctive cleft chin. In 1865, as the war drew to a close, she had another daughter, Hope, named with bitter irony on the day they heard rumors that the Union Army was approaching Charleston. And in 1867, 2 years after emancipation, Rose gave birth to her 18th and final child, a girl she named Freedom. That final pregnancy nearly killed her. She hemorrhaged badly after Freedom's birth, and Aunt Judith, now ancient and half-blind, stayed with her for 3 days, pressing herbs into the bleeding, whispering prayers in a language that had survived the Middle Passage. Rose survived, but something in her was fundamentally broken. She would have no more children. Her body had finally given out. But here's what makes Rose's story both heartbreaking and remarkable. She stayed. Even after emancipation, even after she was legally free to leave, Rose stayed at Whitmore Plantation. People judged her for this, whispered that she must have wanted it, must have loved Edmund in some twisted way, but the truth was more complicated and more tragic. Rose had 18 children, and in the chaos of Reconstruction, she had nowhere to take them. No money, no education, no family that hadn't been scattered to the winds during slavery. Edmund, now struggling. Financially, like most former plantation owners, offered her a deal. She could stay on the plantation as a paid servant, and her children could work the land as sharecroppers. The pay was almost nothing, the arrangement barely different from slavery, but it kept her children under one roof. It kept them alive. So Rose stayed, and she watched Edmund grow old, watched him maintain his position in Charleston society, even as his fortune dwindled. She watched him with his legitimate white children and grandchildren, watched him play the role of patriarch and pillar of the community. And she said nothing, because speaking would endanger her children, and protecting her children was the only thing Rose had left. Edmund Whitmore III died in 1891 at the age of 72. His obituary in the Charleston newspaper called him a distinguished veteran of the Confederacy, a devoted family man, and a respected landowner. It made no mention of Rose or the 18 children he had fathered through systematic rape over a period of 23 years. Rose lived another 12 years, dying in 1903 at the age of 70. By then, most of her children had scattered, seeking opportunities in northern cities where their light skin might afford them the chance to pass as white and escape some of the grinding racism of the Jim Crow South. A few stayed in South Carolina, marrying into black families, their children and grandchildren carrying the Whitmore features forward through generations. Rose was buried in an unmarked grave in the black section of the local cemetery, her death noted in no newspaper. Her name preserved only in the memories of her descendants and in whispered stories of the old plantation days. For more than a century, she would be remembered as a cautionary tale, a woman whose tragedy was somehow twisted into a moral failing. People who didn't understand, who couldn't imagine the powerlessness of her position, would ask, why did she let it happen? Why didn't she fight harder? Why did she stay? They asked the wrong questions. The question wasn't why Rose didn't fight. She fought every day she survived. The question wasn't why she stayed. She stayed for her children. The real question, the question that should have been asked but never was, is this: who was Edmund Whitmore III, really? What kind of man systematically rapes an enslaved girl for more than 2 decades? What kind of society protects and honors such a man while condemning his victim to silence and shame? Dr. Amelia Cross wasn't looking for Rose's story when she found it. The 38-year-old historian from Columbia University was researching economic patterns on post-Civil War plantations in South Carolina. Dry academic work that involved wading through decades of financial records, crop yields, and property transfers. The Whitmore Plantation archives had been donated to the Charleston Historical Society in 1994 by Edmund Whitmore VI, the last descendant to live on the property before it was sold to developers. Most of the records had been cataloged and digitized, but there were still boxes in the climate-controlled basement that no one had fully processed. It was in one of these boxes, on a rainy Tuesday in March 2024, that Amelia found the ledger. It was leather-bound, about the size of a modern laptop, with EW2, private accounts embossed on the cover in fading gold letters. Amelia almost set it aside, assuming it would contain more of the financial records she'd been reviewing all week, but something made her open it. Maybe it was the word private. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was Rose herself, reaching across 120 years to finally tell her story. The first pages were indeed financial records. Payments to merchants, receipts for goods, notes about crop prices. But about 20 pages in, the content changed. In Edmund Whitmore's careful, educated handwriting, Amelia began to read entries that made her blood run cold. June 15, 1847. The new housegirl Rose is proving most satisfactory. She is young and comely, and most importantly, she understands her position. March 3, 1848. Rose has delivered a girl child. The infant is quite fair. I have instructed Aunt Judith to attend to the matter discreetly. September 12, 1849. Rose is with child again. Catherine suspects nothing, praise God. Page after page, year after year, Edmund had documented his sexual exploitation of Rose with the same meticulous attention to detail he applied to his cotton yields and property acquisitions. He recorded the dates he visited her. He noted each pregnancy. He described the appearance of each child with an almost scientific detachment that was somehow more chilling than outright cruelty. But what truly shocked Amelia was what came near the end of the ledger. In entries from the 1880s, Edmund reflected on his relationship with Rose with something approaching self-awareness. November 8, 1883. I am now 64 years old, and Rose is in her 50s. I confess that I have thought much lately about our arrangement. My legitimate children and grandchildren thrive, yet I am haunted by the faces of those other children, the ones who bear my features but can never bear my name. Rose has never spoken a word of reproach to me, though God knows she has every right. I sometimes wonder if she hates me. I suspect she must. I would hate me, in her position. And yet, we continue as we have always continued. I am too old to change now, and she is too worn down to fight. This is what we have made of our lives. There were 18 children documented in the ledger, each one listed with their date of birth, their appearance, and occasional notes about their personalities or abilities. Edmund had essentially created a parallel family tree, a shadow genealogy that existed alongside his legitimate white family but could never be acknowledged. The final entry in the ledger was dated April 3, 1891, just 2 weeks before Edmund's death. "I am dying. The doctor says I have perhaps a month left, perhaps less. I have made no provision for Rose or her children in my will. Catherine and my legitimate heirs would never forgive such an acknowledgement. But let this ledger stand as a testament to the truth. I fathered 18 children with Rose, an enslaved woman who had no power to refuse me. I called it my right as a master. But as I face my final judgment, I confess that I know it for what it truly was, a sin of the gravest kind. Rose, if anyone ever finds this record and you are still alive to hear of it, I ask your forgiveness, though I have no right to ask anything of you ever again." Amelia sat in the archive basement for a long time after reading that final entry, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. She had been a professional historian for 15 years, had read countless documents about slavery and its aftermath, had thought she understood the brutality and violence of the institution. But this was different. This was one specific woman, one specific monster, and the 18 children caught between them. This was personal in a way that made it unbearable. She immediately recognized the historical significance of the find. Plantation records that explicitly acknowledged the rape of enslaved women by their masters were extremely rare. The sexual exploitation had been systematic and widespread. Historians estimated that tens of thousands of enslaved women had been raped by white men during the slavery era. But it was rarely documented. Masters didn't write down their crimes. They relied on social codes of silence, on laws that didn't recognize enslaved women as capable of being raped, on a society that blamed the victims rather than the perpetrators. But Edmund Whitmore had written it all down, and in doing so, he had created a historical record that vindicated Rose and condemned himself. Amelia spent the next 3 months verifying the ledger's authenticity. She worked with forensic document experts who confirmed the age of the paper and ink. She cross-referenced the birth dates in the ledger with other plantation records, with cemetery records, with census data. Everything matched. She tracked down descendants of the Whitmore family, both the legitimate white line and the black descendants of Rose's children. This was how she met Teresa Johnson, a 72-year-old woman living in Atlanta who turned out to be Rose's great-great-granddaughter through Grace, the eldest child. Teresa had grown up hearing stories about Grandma Rose, who worked on the Whitmore plantation, but the details had been vague, the story shrouded in shame and silence. When Amelia showed her copies of the ledger entries, Teresa wept. "My whole life, I've had people in the family wonder about our light skin, our features," Teresa said. "Some people said we must have white ancestors somewhere, but nobody wanted to talk about how that happened. Nobody wanted to say the word rape. He just pretended. Like maybe it was a love story, or maybe it didn't matter anymore because it was so long ago. But it does matter. It matters that we finally know the truth. It matters that somebody wrote down that he did this to her, that it wasn't her fault." Through Teresa and genealogical research, Amelia was able to identify dozens of living descendants of Rose's 18 children. Some had been passing as white for generations, their black ancestry a carefully guarded secret. Others had married into black families and built lives in predominantly black communities. Many had no idea they were related to each other. This vast, extended family scattered across the country, connected by one woman's suffering. Amelia organized a gathering in Charleston in July 2024, inviting all of Rose's descendants she could locate. 83 people showed up, ranging from teenagers to elderly grandparents. They came from California and New York, from Texas and Michigan, from right there in South Carolina. They came in all shades, from pale white to deep brown, carrying the evidence of Rose's mixed-race children and their subsequent marriages across racial lines. At the gathering, held in a community center just miles from where the Whitmore plantation had once stood, Amelia presented her findings. She projected images of the ledger pages onto a screen, showing Edmund's handwriting, his cold documentation of his crimes. She showed the family tree she had constructed, connecting a LL-18 of Rose's children to their living descendants. She showed the photograph, the one that had survived in Teresa's family for generations, of Rose with her 18 children. And then she did something that made headlines around the world. She read Edmund Whitmore's final confession aloud, the entry where he admitted what he had done and asked for forgiveness. The room was absolutely silent except for the sound of her voice and the quiet weeping of people confronting a truth their family had carried in silence for nearly 150 years. When she finished reading, an elderly man named Marcus stood up. He was a descendant of Thomas, Rose's second child. "My grandfather told me once that we came from shame," he said, his voice breaking. "He said our light skin was a mark of something shameful that happened a long time ago, and we should just be grateful we could use it to get ahead in the world. I grew up thinking my great-great-grandmother Rose was, I don't even want to say what I thought, but she wasn't any of those things. She was a victim. She was a survivor, and she protected her children the only way she could." Others stood to share their stories. A woman named Jennifer, descended from Hope, talked about how her mother had passed as white and married a white man who never knew the truth. "I grew up white," Jennifer said. "I didn't know I had any black ancestry until I took a DNA test last year. When my mom found out I'd done the test, she had a panic attack. Shh. Made me promise never to tell anyone. But I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending my ancestors' pain didn't happen." The gathering lasted for hours, turning into an impromptu family reunion and healing circle. People exchanged phone numbers and email addresses, connected with cousins they never knew existed, pieced together the puzzle of their shared history. Many of them visited Rose's grave together the next day. It was still unmarked, but they brought flowers, hundreds of them, and someone had printed out Rose's photograph and placed it in a weatherproof frame. Standing there at the cemetery, Teresa spoke for the group. "Grandma Rose, we finally know the truth. We finally know that you didn't choose this, that you survived something unimaginable, that you protected your children the only way you could. We're here to tell you that we see you, we honor you, and we will make sure your story is finally told the way it should have been told all along, not as a cautionary tale about a woman's shame, but as a testament to a woman's strength." Amelia's research was published in the American Historical Review in September 2024, and it immediately sparked national conversations about slavery, sexual violence, and the lasting impact of racial trauma. The article was titled, "The Ledger of Truth, Edmund Whitmore III and the Systematic Rape of Rose, an Enslaved Woman, 1847 to 1867. But Amelia didn't stop with academic publication. She worked with documentary filmmakers to create a film about Rose's story. She consulted with the Charleston Historical Society to create an exhibit about Rose and the thousands of other enslaved women who experienced similar violence. She helped Rose's descendants raise money for a proper headstone, which was unveiled in November 2024 in a ceremony attended by more than 200 people. The headstone reads, "Rose, 1833 to 1903. Beloved mother, survivor and keeper of the truth, mother of 18 children. Your silence has been broken. Your story will never be forgotten." Perhaps most importantly, Amelia worked with educators to ensure that Rose's story would be taught in schools, not as a footnote to the history of slavery, but as a central example of how sexual violence was used as a tool of oppression, and how the legal and social systems of slavery and Jim Crow protected perpetrators while silencing victims. The Whitmore family's response to the revelation was mixed. Some of Edmund's white descendants refused to acknowledge the ledger or their connection to Rose's children. But others, particularly younger family members, reached out to their newly discovered black relatives. One of Edmund's great-great-great-grandsons, a man named David Whitmore, attended the gathering in Charleston and publicly apologized for his ancestors' crimes. "I can't undo what Edmund did," David said. "I can't give Rose back her freedom or her body or her peace. But I can acknowledge the truth. I can say that what he did was evil, that Rose and her children deserved better, that they are my family, and that I'm honored to know them. As for the plantation itself, it no longer exists. The land was sold to developers in the 1990s and turned into a gated community of expensive homes. But the Charleston Historical Society has proposed turning the old Whitmore family cemetery, which still exists on one preserved acre, into a memorial site for Rose and other enslaved women who suffered similar fates. The proposal has faced opposition from some local residents who say it's too painful, too accusatory, too focused on the negative aspects of Charleston's history. But Rose's descendants and their allies have fought back, arguing that the truth, however painful, is necessary for healing and for justice. "This isn't about making white people feel guilty," Teresa explained to a local news station. "This is about making sure women like Rose are finally seen as the human beings they were." She was 14 when it started. 14. She was a child, and what happened to her happened to thousands of other enslaved women and girls. If we don't tell their stories, if we don't name the men who hurt them, then we're complicit in the same culture of silence that protected those men in the first place. On a cool evening in December 2024, 83 of Rose's descendants gathered again in Charleston for a candlelight vigil at her grave. The new headstone gleamed in the flickering light, and someone had brought a blown-up copy of the photograph, placing it on an easel beside the grave. Amelia stood before the gathering and spoke. "Rose's story teaches us many things. It teaches us about the horrors of slavery and the particular violence inflicted on black women and girls. It teaches us about how legal systems can be designed to protect perpetrators and silence victims. It teaches us about generational trauma and the ways that pain echoes through families for generations. But Rose's story also teaches us about resistance, because surviving, in Rose's circumstances, was resistance. Protecting her children was resistance. Living to see freedom, even though that freedom was incomplete and imperfect, was resistance. And leaving behind descendants who are here today, strong and proud and ready to claim her story, that is resistance too. For 120 years, people judged Rose without knowing the full truth. They blamed her for her own victimization. They whispered about her instead of shouting about the man who hurt her. But the truth has a way of coming out. Edmund wrote it down, perhaps because even monsters sometimes have consciences, or perhaps because he knew that history would eventually demand an accounting. The ledger exists now as proof, not just of Edmund's crimes, but of Rose's humanity. Every entry that documented another assault, another pregnancy, another child, is also proof that Rose was there, that she mattered, that what happened to her was real and wrong and deserving of our attention and our grief. Rose, we finally know your name. We finally know your story, and we promise you that we will tell it again and again, until every person understands that what happened to you was not your shame to carry. It was Edmund's. It was the shame of every person and every system that allowed it to happen. Your children and grandchildren and great-great-great-grandchildren are here to say, we see you, we honor you, and we will make sure you are never forgotten again. As Amelia finished speaking, Teresa stepped forward with a small wooden box. Inside were 18 white roses, one for each of Rose's children. Each descendant present was invited to take a rose and place it on the grave, speaking the name of the child they descended from. "Grace," said one woman, laying down her rose. "Thomas," said another Mary. "Jonathan, Rebecca, Samuel, Elizabeth, Catherine, Daniel, Ruth, James, Sarah, Nathan, Isaac, Hope, Freedom, and finally, for the 2 children whose lines had not survived or had not been found, for the ones we haven't met yet, but who are part of this family too." When all 18 roses lay on the grave, the group stood together in silence. NCE, feeling the weight of history, the pain of generations, and also something else. The power of truth finally told, the strength of family finally united, the healing that comes when silence is broken and shame is replaced with understanding. Rose's story doesn't have a fairy tale ending. She didn't escape. She didn't see justice in her lifetime. She died poor and obscure, her suffering unacknowledged by the world that had allowed it. But her story has an ending that matters. She is finally known. She is finally honored. And the man who hurt her is finally named not as a respected patriarch, but as what he truly was, a rapist who used the law and social customs of his time to brutalize a powerless girl for more than 20 years. This is the message Rose's story carries forward. That truth matters, even when it comes 140 years late. That victims deserve to be believed and honored, not blamed and forgotten. That the systems and laws and social customs that protect powerful predators must be named and dismantled, and that families, even families born from violence and suffering, can find strength and healing in claiming their full history, the painful parts and the resilient parts together. Rose gave birth to 18 children. She survived what should have broken her. She protected them as best she could in a world determined to destroy them both. And now, finally, she is remembered not as a cautionary tale or a source of shame, but as what she always was, a survivor, other, and a witness to a truth that would not stay buried forever. Her silence has been broken, her story is told, and that in the end is a kind of justice that even death cannot diminish.